Build quickly, build grandly, then tear it down. If that sentence does not trouble you, it should, because in the older mind, to build was to bind yourself to time. Stone was a promise. Brick was a lineage. A roof meant your grandchildren would stand under it and remember your name. So why did entire cities appear? Only to vanish. World fairs are described as celebrations, exhibitions, temporary wonders made to honor industry and progress. And yet, when you look at the surviving photographs, quiet, black and white, patient, something refuses to fit the story. Boulevards laid out with authority, vast courts, domes and colonnades, grand stairways that seem to lead to institutions, not kiosks, buildings with the posture of empires, and then the official footnote: when demolished, dismantled, lost to fire, removed after the fair. A person can accept one such event, even two, but across nations, across decades, the pattern repeats like a ritual of forgetting. Here is the uncomfortable question. If a civilization can raise a palace in a season, why does it claim it cannot maintain it for a generation? And if the structures were truly meant to be temporary, why do they look as though they were designed for permanence? Consider the way the façades were composed. Symmetry like a temple, entrances like cathedrals, ornament that demands trained hands, not hurried hands. A craftsman does not carve for a single summer unless someone orders him to treat time as disposable. And that idea, disposable grandeur, is strangely modern. Yet the fairs belong to the age that claims it was discovering permanence: rail, steel, masonry, electricity. So we stand in the evidence and listen. We listen to the silence between two facts. They built at enormous scale, and then they erased the proof that they could. What remains today is often a fragment, a single building spared, a museum repurposed, a tower left standing like a bone. The rest is gone, as if the fairgrounds were a dream. But dreams do not require foundations. These did. They required quarries, kilns, carpenters by the hundreds, painters, plasterers, metal workers, entire guilds of hands. And after all that, they chose absence. Or they accepted it. Or perhaps, in some quiet way, they needed it. For now, we do not explain. We only keep the paradox alive. A city built to be seen by the world, then unbuilt. It's as if seeing it for too long would change what people believe about the past. Walk the fairgrounds in your imagination, not as a tourist, as a chronicler. You pass through an entrance gate that looks like a triumphal arch. You arrive at a court wide enough for processions. You face a central building that carries a dome, a tower, or a façade like a palace of state. And then you remember what you were told. Temporary. This is where doubt becomes practical. A temporary building can be a tent, a timber shed, a light pavilion. But these World Fair structures wore the language of capitals. They spoke in colonnades and grand staircases, in high cornices and disciplined symmetry. So, let us take a few places, names we can hold, without turning them into legends. Chicago, 1893. The fair is remembered for the White City, an entire classical-looking complex raised for the Columbian Exposition. Photographs show vast courts and monumental façades, arranged like an imperial plan. Then the story turns. Much was dismantled, some burned. A handful survived in altered form. St. Louis, 1904. Again, the same atmosphere. Grand avenues, formal buildings, an architecture that seems to announce civilization itself. And again, disappearance. Most structures reduced to memory, leaving only remnants. San Francisco, 1915. The Panama Pacific Exposition built an ornate tower of jewels, a celebrated centerpiece, and then it too was taken down. A jewel tower, made to be unmade. And in these examples, official history offers a consistent explanation. They were built of staff, plaster and fiber over frames, meant to imitate stone, all cheaply, quickly. A theatrical skin. That sounds complete, but it does not dissolve the unease, because even imitation requires mastery. To compose facades that, convincing on that scale, demands architects who already know the grammar of grandeur. It demands artisans who can produce ornament in quantities that feel almost industrial, yet still coherent, still measured. And then there is the question of effort. Even if the walls were light, the labor was not. Ground must be graded, roads laid, water carried, electric lines strung, gardens planted, fountains fed, crowds managed. A temporary city still requires the discipline of a permanent one. So, why build it only to erase it? In older cultures, a festival leaves marks, a shrine, a gate, a monument, something to bind the memory into place. Yet here, the mark is often absence, as if the celebration was designed to be unrepeatable, as if the proof of capability, of raising cities, had to be kept from becoming ordinary. And notice what vanishes most reliably, not the utilitarian parts, not the infrastructure buried underground. What vanishes is the face, the façade, the ceremonial architecture, the part that would teach later generations what was possible. So, we are left with a careful suspicion, spoken softly. Perhaps the fairs were not simply entertainment. Perhaps they were demonstrations of power, of coordination, of inherited craft, presented briefly, then withdrawn. Not because it could not remain, but because if it remained, the public might start asking questions. Questions like, if you can build a palace in months, what else could have been built before records began? And if those palaces can vanish by policy, by fire, by dismantling, what else might have vanished the same way? In the old way of thinking, a city is not only buildings, it is a ritual. It has a center, axes, processional routes, places where crowds move as one body, guided by architecture like a hand on the shoulder. World fairs understood this. Even when they claimed to be temporary, they were laid out with ceremony, a grand court, a central palace, long perspectives that pull the eye forward. Water, light, and height arranged to make the visitor feel small and grateful. This is not an accident of entertainment. It is the language of authority. So, the fair becomes a strange thing, a temporary ritual city where the public learns a lesson without being told it is a lesson. The lesson is, we can summon a world, we can organize it, yes, we can dissolve it. And the visitor goes home with a new sense of scale. But then the buildings vanish, and now the visitor, years later, cannot return to confirm what was seen. Only photographs remain, and photographs are quiet. They do not argue. They do not demand maintenance budgets. They can be archived, edited, forgotten in drawers. This is where the question deepens, not why did they tear it down, but why was it acceptable to tear it down? Because in any town, if a cathedral rises, the town bends around it. If a courthouse rises, it becomes the anchor of memory. To remove it would feel like erasing a family grave. Yet fairgrounds were treated differently, as if the structures had no right to become ancestors. And perhaps that is the point. Ancestral buildings create continuity. Continuity creates comparisons. If the White City remained in Chicago, people would measure all later construction against it. If the Tower of Jewels remained in San Francisco, the city would have to explain why later public buildings look poorer, flatter, more temporary than the temporary ones. The fair architecture in that sense is dangerous. It reveals a peak, and peaks provoke uncomfortable questions. So, instead, the peak is cut away and preserved only as an image, safe, distant, unquestionable. But even that is not the strangest part. The strangest part is how familiar the fair architecture looks. Classical orders, domes, arches, palaces. It borrows from older civilizations, Rome, Renaissance courts, temple traditions, yet presents them as a modern celebration, as if the modern world required the authority of the ancient world to legitimize itself. And then, having borrowed that authority for a season, it discards the costume. This feels less like building, and more like staging. A staged memory of grandeur, a controlled encounter with civilization, offered briefly, then withdrawn. Now return to the hook one last time, softly. Build quickly, grandly, then tear down. The official story says, because it was temporary and too costly to keep. But cost is not only money, cost is meaning. To keep those buildings would mean keeping their questions. And the questions are heavy. If coordination and craft could produce whole monumental cities on command, what does that imply about the past we are told was scattered, slow, primitive, and struggling? If a fair can appear like a capital overnight, how many capitals might have existed, then disappeared, leaving only fragments and relabeled ruins? Yes, we do not conclude. We simply leave the listener with a final image, a vast court of white façades, crowded with people in their best clothes, a city that looks permanent, a city that promises time, and then, a few years later, grass, empty air, streets that lead nowhere. The world built a monument, and then proved it could erase it. There is a particular kind of forgetting that does not feel like loss. It feels like cleanup. A fair ends, the banners come down, the crowds leave, and the city decides to restore the park, return the land, move on. Words that sound gentle. But when the structures are monumental, when they resemble palaces, cleanup becomes something else. It becomes an act of control over memory, because what we leave standing becomes a witness, and what we remove becomes a rumor. In older societies, ruins were powerful. They instructed the living, they warned, they humbled. A ruin was a teacher that did not need permission. World fairs, strangely, refused to leave many ruins behind. Even when fire did the work, the result was the same: disappearance. No lingering bones across generations. No long-term comparison between then and now. Only carefully framed remnants. A single museum, a single tower, a single administrative building spared and relabeled. And that sparing is itself a clue. Because what survives is often what can be absorbed into official continuity. A building that can be renamed museum. A structure that can be made useful without provoking too many questions. What vanishes is the overwhelming whole, the proof of scale. So, if we keep faith with an older way of thinking, we may read the fairs differently, not as random festivals, but as ritual demonstrations. A place where a society displays its command of craft, labor, and symbolism. A place where it invites the world to witness. We can build a civilization on schedule. Then, like a magician ending a performance, it removes the apparatus. Not because it was impossible to keep, because keeping it would change the story. And the story is always a kind of government. A story tells a people what is normal, what is possible, what must be admired, what must be forgotten. The fairs declared, modernity is powerful, but they used ancient language to do it. Domes, colonnades, imperial courts, because power still needs ancestry. Then they erased the evidence so that modern cities could later appear as the highest achievement available. No embarrassing comparison. No question from an ordinary citizen. Standing in an ordinary street, asking why yesterday's temporary grandeur looks greater than today's permanent institutions. And so, the paradox remains, but now it carries weight. Build quickly, build grandly, then tear down. This pattern suggests a society that treats architecture not only as shelter, but as narrative. A society that can summon a past, classical, authoritative, perfected, then dismiss it when the lesson has been delivered. In that sense, the World Fair is not only an event, it is a gate, a controlled doorway through which millions walked, briefly touching a vision of permanence, before returning to everyday fragility. And perhaps that is why the buildings could not stay. Because once a person has seen a city of palaces built in months, it becomes harder to accept that the world is limited by time, money, or labor. It becomes harder to accept that history only moves forward in small steps. So the fairgrounds were cleared, and the memory was sealed into photographs and postcards, safe, flat, distant. Yet the questions still move under the surface. What other monumental landscapes might have been temporary? What other ruins might have been cleaned up? What other peaks might have been trimmed away so the present could look like the summit? And if the modern world could build and erase whole ceremonial cities within a few years, then perhaps the past we inherit is not only what happened, it is what was permitted to remain.